Speech bubbles are one of the aspects that distinguish manga from anime. A simple observation would be that speech bubbles in manga contain the words spoken by a character, but a mangaka conveys far more information through speech bubbles than just the spoken words. In this video, I want to talk about the general emotional spectrum on which every speech bubble exists. In other words, what the shape of a speech bubble reveals about the emotional state of the speaking character. Before we take a closer look at this emotional spectrum, I want to begin with an introductory example from Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball manga, and how the depiction of the mental state of a certain transformation benefits from the use of speech bubbles. This serves as an introductory example to better understand how speech bubbles can convey information. In Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball manga, generally speaking, good characters use round, cloud-like speech bubbles. Of course, there are specific exceptions, and the emotional state of the good characters also plays a role here, but in general, good characters are associated with round, cloud-like speech bubbles. When Goku speaks in a calm state, his words are always presented in these types of speech bubbles. However, this changes when Goku enters the Super Saiyan state. In the Super Saiyan state, Goku's speech bubbles are depicted as angular. Toriyama consistently uses angular speech bubbles for his villains, such as Frieza, Cell, and Buu, but also for characters like Piccolo and Vegeta. The shift from Goku's cloud-like speech bubbles to angular ones when he becomes a Super Saiyan is a visual indication that the Super Saiyan state is fundamentally different. Goku is angry. This change in speech bubbles applies to the Super Saiyan state in general, and later also to the character Trunks, who speaks in cloud-like speech bubbles when he's in his normal state, but uses angular ones when he becomes a Super Saiyan. This is demonstrated very clearly in Goku's and Trunks' first conversation, where both speak to each other in round speech bubbles in their normal states and then switch to angular speech bubbles once they transform into Super Saiyans. The climax of these subtle visual cues occurs when Goku and Gohan finish the training in the Room of Spirit and Time. The goal of this training was to perfect the Super Saiyan transformation in a way that would allow it to function as a normal state for them. And they succeed in doing exactly that. Toriyama visualized this in a way that the anime cannot convey. From this point onward in the story, Goku and Gohan retain their round speech bubbles while in the Super Saiyan state. This emphasizes that the Super Saiyan state form has now become their normal state. Mikio Ikimoto's Boruto manga is an excellent example for understanding the emotional spectrum on which speech bubble exists. Simply put, every speech bubble of every character in the Boruto manga exists on a spectrum that visually demonstrates to the reader the emotional state of the speaking character and the manner in which the content of the speech bubble is being delivered. This spectrum ranges from calm and composed to angry and shouting, including all the gray areas between those two extremes. The character through whom this emotional spectrum can be illustrated most clearly is Ishiki Otsutsuki. As readers, we have seen him from his introduction as a calm and composed leader of Kara, all the way to his death battle, which pushed him to his emotional limits. And this emotional journey that Ishiki undergoes is exceptionally well represented through speech bubbles. In the form of Jin, we see how calmly Ishiki speaks to his subordinates, and how his words are therefore placed in almost perfectly round speech bubbles. During Delta's conversation with Ishiki, she destroys the table on which Ishiki's meal is placed, driven by her anger. Yet, Ishiki remains completely calm and responds to Delta in a composed tone. So calm, in fact, that the speech bubbles containing his words could be described as a 1 on the emotional spectrum. We see Ishiki in a slightly more agitated state several chapters later, when Delta returns to the hideout. Ishiki learns, first, that Kashin Koji is not interested in retrieving the vessel, and second, that Boruto Uzumaki also bears a karma mark. During this conversation, Ishiki is no longer in a composed state, and his speech bubble visually communicates this. They are no longer round, but angular and edged. On the emotional spectrum, his speech bubbles would now be positioned somewhere in the middle. A particularly interesting moment occurs during Ishiki's conversation with Kashin Koji. Ishiki and Kashin Koji discuss the events that led to this point in the story, and Ishiki appears to be calm and composed, but this is not truly the case. Kashin Koji sees through Ishiki's act and directly addresses his feigned calmness. Ikimoto visualized this exact aspect through the shape of Ishiki's speech bubbles. If Ishiki were speaking in a truly calm state, his speech bubbles would be completely round. Instead, we see Ishiki's speech bubble fluctuate throughout the conversation, shifting back and forth between relatively round and angular with edges. The climax of Ishiki's emotional state occurs during his death battle against the main characters, more specifically during his fight against Baryon Mode Naruto. Throughout this battle against the protagonists, Ishiki is occasionally depicted with more angular speech bubbles, but during the fight against Baryon Mode Naruto, this changes drastically. In this battle, Ishiki loses the majority of his remaining lifespan and experiencing genuine fear of death. He becomes increasingly angry, frustrated, and insulting. At this point, his speech bubbles are positioned at the very top end of the emotional spectrum. They are angular and their edges converge into multiple sharp points, creating an extremely aggressive visual impression. The speech bubbles containing Ishiki's desperate scream of Kawaki's name is the largest speech bubble in the entire manga and spans a full manga page. It is something special and completely breaks the emotional spectrum. What follows are speech bubbles from Ishiki that have so many sharp points they could be described as star-shaped. If round speech bubbles represent a 1 on the spectrum, then these star-shaped speech bubbles represent a 10 out of 10 on the emotional spectrum. Precisely because Ishiki is the character who occupies every position on the emotional spectrum, he is the best character to demonstrate the spectrum. Ishiki was introduced as a calm and composed character and died as the loudest and most desperate character in the story. It is important to understand that this emotional spectrum in which speech bubbles exist applies to every character in the entire manga, without exceptions, and is not exclusive to Ishiki. Additionally, it is important to mention that nearly every comic visualizes the emotional state of the speaking character through the shape of speech bubbles. To explain this concept, I chose Mikio Ikimoto's Boruto manga because in my opinion, this spectrum is depicted there in an especially rich and nuanced way. This video only fulfills its full purpose once this knowledge is understood and actively applied, in a sense, in collaboration with you, the viewer. This is why I have two questions. Based on this understanding, what can be said about the character Jura and his speech bubbles? Furthermore, I previously claimed that Ishiki has the largest speech bubbles in the entire Boruto manga, but that's not entirely true. He actually shares this position with another character. Which character also has a speech bubble that spans an entire manga page and therefore shares first place with Ishiki for the largest speech bubble in the entire manga?